Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 17th CEPR EAERE webinar on climate policies. I'm Christian Gaudier. I'm chairing this webinar. And this time, we will have a debate on the economic case for climate finance at scale. We will have one paper presentation by Patrick Bolton from Imperial College London, and from Alissa Kleinen-Huys from Imperial College and Cornell University. I will give them 40 minutes for their presentation. And then we will have two panelists. One will be Lasse Pedersen from Copenhagen Business School, and the other will be Jeff Hill from Columbia University. So just a brief introduction to this webinar. We will have next month the COP29. One of the big issues of that COP, as for previous COP, is how to fund the decarbonization of the South. We will need a lot of money for that, and there is an issue about how finance could contribute to this. We are talking here about potentially $1 trillion a year. So that's the issue that we will be discussing today. So Alissa, the floor is yours.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christian, for hosting us, both Patrick and I, to give a webinar on our paper, The Economic Case for Climate Finance at Scale. This is also work joined with Chairman Zettelmeier from Bruegel. And I also would very much like to thank the two discussants, Lasse and Jeffrey, for your kindness to read our paper, and I'm very much looking forward to your remarks and feedback and our discussion. But let me now start with an introduction, and once I get to the meat of the paper, I will sometimes pause and give the microphone to Patrick, who might give some additional perspectives beyond the ones that I am providing in the presentation that I will mainly lead. But Patrick and I will both be the two speakers in a discussion, and Patrick will chip in at some moments in time during my presentation. So let me give you very briefly sort of the big picture reason for why we should care, right? So this paper is really about the economic case for climate finance at scale, not just to decarbonize developed countries, but to decarbonize the global economy, including also emerging and developing market economies. So we know that if we cannot get emerging and developing market economies on board, we will still have very large rising emissions, because most emissions in the 21st century will come from these regions, which will, even if we are as a West net zero, will cause great climate damages. So if we just look at what is already happening today, not even how it might get worse, we've seen, for example, this summer that Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton hit the United States, and there was a paper that just came out on October 21st estimating that the cost, the economic damages of these two storms together is around 30 billion, and also saying that these damages are much exacerbated by climate change. Then there was an article on October 7th in the New York Times saying there is no climate haven. So it's very comforting to think that you might live somewhere in the north of the world, in a place where you will not be affected, and that such a place was North Carolina, which was hit by Hurricane Helene, sorry, or I always get it the wrong way around. So they thought they were a climate haven essentially, yet they got over 250 billion of damages. So just a few days ago, a report got published by the United Nations called the Emission Gap Report, and they concluded that on current policies, our world is on course for global warming of over 3.1 degrees Celsius, and that the remaining carbon budget to stay within the goals of the Paris Agreement which is ideally 1.5 degrees with 50% certainty, has shrank to just 200 gigatons of CO2. So I just pulled this morning the ticking climate clock from the Mercator Institute of Research, and they actually show that the carbon budget is now 199 gigatons for 1.5 degrees, leaving us only 4 years, 8 months, and 24 days before we're out. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that it's not innocent to go beyond 1.5 degrees. There's ample academic research by climate scientists showing that every 0.1 degree above 1.5 degrees of warming significantly increases severe and adverse climate impacts all over the world. And more worryingly, once we go further above 1.5 degrees, and actually at 1.5 degrees we're not quite safe, we risk crossing so-called climate tipping points, which essentially are thresholds where up to some point you can exert more emissions, and you need to push it over the edge. But once it's over the edge, it may cause climate impacts to accelerate in a non-linear, self-amplifying fashion that is often non-reversible. For example, just this summer, there are a lot of climate scientists, including Stefan Ramshoff from the Potsdam Institute, who are warning world leaders that we are getting to a point where the Atlantic Meridian ocean circulation, which governs our climate in the north of the world mostly, may collapse, which will overnight change our weather patterns, and which may cause other climate tipping points to be crossed, such as the die down of the Amazon rainforest, which is so far I think still a major carbon sink, and of course a home of rich biodiversity. Now, some of people have suggested, because we're so close to 1.5 degrees, that maybe it's hard to achieve, and we can temporarily overshoot the temperature target, only to get back down afterwards. But actually, there's a paper that just got published on October 9th in Nature by climate scientists and by the editorial board, basically saying that this is not a safe strategy, because the more you overshoot the temperature target of 1.5, in the interim, you get higher climate damages, which is probably not equitable for the global south, who already suffers a lot and is not that wealthy. But also you might cross climate tipping points, so even if you get the temperature back down afterwards, you might not be able to reverse. Plus, it relies on the assumption that we can deploy carbon capture and storage at scale, which so far is not a proven technology. We are currently able to suck 2 seconds of annual emissions out of the air with carbon capture and storage with the Orca plant in Ireland. And it's also so far a non-learning technology that, unlike renewables, has not really gotten much cheaper. So relying on this unproven technology at scale to get back down to 1.5 degrees, even if that's, that's very risky, because you might still have these irreversible impacts. But even if you can do it, we may not be able to get scale. And this paper that underlies it also says we probably will need some capacity of carbon capture and storage to deal with situations where the transient response to climate change is greater than expected. So we have more warming for a given amount of emissions. So then we want to have that capacity to just basically rein in tail risk, rather than just to use it to overshoot temperature targets. So the final point of my sort of high-level introduction is to say that even though we have agreed on the Paris Agreement in 2015, to aim to get temperature not to increase globally on average more than 2 degrees, ideally not more than 1.5, we actually have not yet seen a dent in the rise of global emissions. So we're still on a rising global emission trend up till 2023. So the latest emission report says that the greenhouse gas emissions in 2003 have reached an all-time high of 57.1 gigatons. And CO2 emissions, according to the International Energy Agency, have reached an all-time high of 3.4. So we're not even on the bend towards net zero yet. And the second point to realize from this graph is that the climate crisis, as Al Gore said in his TED Talk report, is really a fossil fuel crisis. If you look at this graph here, you can see that almost all of this is CO2 emissions stem from fossil fuels. So if we want to resolve the climate crisis, we must focus on the financing of the phase out of fossil fuels and its replacement with renewables or other policies that achieve the same effect. The next point on emissions, before I turn to the presentation itself, is to say that actually in 2023, relative to 2024, rich countries, particularly the EU and the US, have slightly decarbonized. The EU by 7.5%, the US, I believe, by 1% or so. But those emissions are more than offset by growing emissions in emerging and developing market economies. So you can see, for example, here on the left plot, that the emissions of China in purple and other OECD countries have risen sharply, and that those increases in emissions are much larger than the slight decarbonization you can see of the EU 27 in red and the United States in blue. So this only reinforces the point that, if we want to decarbonize the world economy, it's not good enough just to focus on developed countries. So then the question is, what can deliver, right? Because we are at this tight carbon budget. We have extremely high risks if we overshoot that carbon budget. So what can get us to net zero at speed and scale? Because that is really what is required. And one more note, Friedman, the New York Times columnist, spoke in Bill Gates' documentary that just came out earlier this month, that climate change is really a scale problem, right? So unless we reach scale, we cannot solve climate change. Okay, so let's focus on these various options to get to net zero: carbon taxation, financial markets, regulation and mandates, and climate finance subsidies. So for a long time, and this is still the case, carbon taxation is seen as a first best policy. And I would tend to agree we should try to do as much as possible of that, including carbon border adjustment mechanisms. But the reality is that despite over at least 30 years of trying since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and before, carbon taxation has not really reached coverage. So only, as you can see here, only 24% of greenhouse gases, according to the World Bank, are priced today. And even those that are priced way below the social cost of carbon. So the Bob Litterman has this carbon barometer showing that the average global carbon price minus fossil fuel subsidies, which the IMF estimated around 7 trillion, is only around $4 per ton of CO2, whereas most climate scientists agree that the social cost of carbon, which is the damage that one extra ton of CO2 does to the global economy, is a lot higher than that. For example, the Biden administration now uses $180 social cost of carbon, and at the 16th CEPR webinar, you probably saw the presentation of Adrian Bilal and Diego Kenzik, who estimate the social cost of carbon to be around over $1,000 per ton of CO2. So the point is that probably in large part because of political reasons, where politicians don't dare to introduce a carbon tax because it will rise the price of fossil fuel goods in the short run, carbon taxation is not applied to all greenhouse gases in all regions at the right social cost of carbon to internalize the carbon externality. So in that world of incomplete carbon taxation, the question pops up: how can we still get to net zero in time if we live in this world of incomplete carbon taxation? And here we get to the paper from Lasse, and I'm sure he will say more about it in his remarks. But Lasse essentially asked, right, can financial markets plug this gap? And as far as I understand his paper, his answer is essentially yes, it can play a role, but it can probably not deliver the magnitude that we need. Whereas again, to reiterate, climate change is a scale problem. So he estimates that to implement only a $40 per ton of CO2 social cost of carbon tax along the lines of Nordhaus, the cost of capital differential between brown and green firms would have to increase by around 4% basis points, which is already hard. But if you want to implement $180 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, it's going to become even more difficult, because the cost of capital differential between brown and green firms would have to rise around 18 basis points, which, according to Lawson, he can later say, if I summarize this correctly, it seems very unrealistic, and it assumes that the cost of capital can be controlled. And even if you can make the cost of capital differential between brown and green firms be around 18%, still it would not achieve the same effect as a carbon tax, because a more expensive lending conditions for brown firms only matter insofar as that brown firm needs capital. But if, let's say, you're a coal-fired power plant and you don't need further capital to continue to operate, this power plant can, in principle, continue running till the end of its lifetime. So if you're in a world where asset stranding of fossil fuels is required, which is the world we live in, if we continue running fossil fuels to the end of the life, we're going to be far exceeding the 1.5 degree carbon budget. Finance alone can't do it, right? And this is exactly the let me see, sorry, 1 second. This is exactly the conclusion that Martin Wolf, a very renowned columnist in the Financial Times, argued. He says market forces alone are not enough to halt climate change. And then, of course, the question is there a role? So basically, carbon taxation alone will unlikely do it alone because of political economy reasons. Financial markets alone won't do it. And so then the question is, can mandates and regulations do it? Well, those can play a very important role, but by themselves are probably also not enough. So this is an article in Science, also published just this summer, August 22nd, saying that it's typically policy combinations that have, at least in the last 2 decades, been most effective in reducing emissions at scale over 2 gigatons. And so then the fourth question is, okay, can climate finance at scale play a role when climate finance is not just done by financial markets, but there is also a role of the public sector in a public-private type of partnership to help bring on board financial markets to pay for most of the decarbonization costs. So to some extent, climate finance, which, public climate finance, which has already been deployed, at least domestically. So the Green Deal and the Inflation Reduction Act are subsidy-based approaches to decarbonization, which have proven successful in decarbonization in the EU and the US. But what I've been arguing since the beginning of this presentation is that just getting the developed countries to decarbonize is not good enough. So there is as I will now start to argue with Patrick in the meat of the presentation, we show an economic case for developed countries to offer public climate finance at scale to emerging and developing market economies to help crowd in private capital to pay for most of the decarbonization efforts. So whilst current climate policy is focused within borders, we argue that developed country climate policy should be extended across borders. And that's really important because as the International Energy Agency and the IFC, International Finance Corporation, report on scaling blended finance for emerging and developing market economies shows, is that there's hardly or way too little private finance going into emerging and developing market economies, primarily because the cost of capital is too high. So as the economist issue on the dawn of the solar age said, is even though batteries are cheaper than ever, plus renewables, making them competitive in many places across the world with fossil fuels, they are not being deployed in EMDEs at anywhere near the scale that is needed because of the cost of capital. So the idea is that with blended finance, you can use as, and this is the paper that Jeffrey Heal has written with Caroline Flammer, you can try to bring down the risk so that the risk-adjusted return for investors exceeds the hurdle rate. So now let's turn to the meat of this presentation. So basically, what have Patrick and I done in this paper with Jeremy Zettermeyer, which is also based on the paper called The Great Carbon Arbitrage with Tobias Adrian from the IMF. So in this paper, we made use of a data set that has information on all the coal mines globally at the mining level, and also all the coal-fired power plants globally at the location level. And what we know is how much coal is being mined and how much, what the capacity is of these coal-fired power plants. And we also know what the emission intensity is of each of the power facilities. And so I'm not showing you the graph here, but we've done an exercise where we've added up the production times emission intensity at the plant level and summed that up, and we find exactly the same global numbers as authoritative estimates of institutions like the International Energy Agency, which gives us confidence that the data set that we use can be relied upon. And so in this paper, we asked actually a really simple question, which is, what are the costs and what are the benefits of phasing out coal? So we argue that on the cost side, there are two main components that are that need to be taken into consideration when you define the parameter of the cost. One is the investment cost in renewables. So if you're going to phase out coal, which is, by the way, the most polluting fossil fuel, so there's a, it's responsible for, I think, 14 gigatons of global emissions. If you phase out coal, you cannot just do that unless you have a plan for what to build in its place, because the primary concern of governments is to maintain energy security, to meet the demand for energy, right? So whenever you phase out coal, you want to replace it with renewables to keep, not only replace it, but keep up with any growth in projected growth in energy demand because of, let's say, growing population, need for electrification, need to create energy access to the grid for those that were not electrolyzed, not yet connected, but also growth of AI and so on. So one component of the cost is the investment costs in renewables, but also the investment costs in the complementary technologies like batteries for short-term storage, lithium batteries, and electrolyzers, which can create green hydrogen for long-term storage, and the investment costs in the grid. The other component of the cost, we argue, is the opportunity cost of coal, which at a minimum is equal, under its strict definition, to the expected missed future free cash flows to the coal owners, discounted back to today. So it's essentially equal to the stranded asset value of coal. And more broadly, you can say that the opportunity cost of coal also encompasses the costs that governments would need to make to compensate workers for their lost wages when they are laid off because coal closes early, and any retraining costs that governments would need to make to help facilitate their entry into a new job, specifically, let's say, a job in renewable growing energy that will replace coal. And then on the benefit side, we argue that there are two components. One is that if you phase out coal, you will reduce emissions substantially. So there are avoided emissions. And those avoided emissions help to avoid climate damages, right? So the benefit from phasing out coal is the avoided climate damages. But also the second component is the avoided or the reduced air pollution and the associated health costs. In this paper, we're not yet modeling air pollution. In the next paper, we do. So what I'm showing you here is what the cost based on these components, what the cost of phasing out coal is globally. And we find that over 2024 to 2050, it's around 23 trillion. And over 2024 to 2030, it's around 12 trillion. And you can see that for advanced countries, for example, in the short run up to 2030, the cost is around 3.8 trillion, whereas the cost to phase out coal in emerging and developing market economies is 8.5 trillion. So you can already see that based on this alone, that most of the coal is being produced in emerging and developing market economies. So if we are to phase out coal according to a net zero scenario this decade, we can, that's not an immediate shutdown, mind you, we can avoid, we estimate, around 174 gigatons of CO2. And if we would do this in a bit sharper way that is completely consistent with the carbon budget that is remaining, we can probably avoid even more. So how does the cost of 12 trillion and 23 trillion compare to the benefits? So we find that the benefits of phasing out coal are around 36 trillion up to 2050, leaving a net benefit of around 13 trillion, and over the course of the century, a net benefit of around 78 trillion. And this is only assuming an $80 global social cost of carbon. If we were to assume a higher number, like the one of the Biden administration of $190 per ton of CO2, we get a net benefit of around, let's say for 2050, 87 trillion, and a net benefit of around 63 trillion. So in terms of the benefit per ton of avoided CO2, that's, for example, $138 per ton of avoided CO2. So what you should take away from this graph is that the net global benefits of phasing out coal are extremely large, even under a conservative estimate of the benefits, not even taking into account air pollution benefits and other, soil benefits and so on. And so our quantitative estimates are broadly consistent with the International Energy IFC estimates, which gives us some confidence that we're broadly speaking right. But importantly, compared to the International Energy Agency, our estimates are a lot more granular. So we offer this not at the region level, but at the country level. And unlike them, we actually provide a methodology that is transparent. So you can change the assumptions and see how it changes outcomes. Also, they just focus on energy phase out as a whole. We narrow it down to coal. That has also never been done before. And we split between the investment cost and the opportunity cost, which is also not something that they do. Of course, the big question is, right, we don't have one global government, but we live in a world with individual governments. So is it also in the interest of individual countries to phase out coal? So to study this, we make use of what is called country-level estimates of the social cost of carbon. So the idea is essentially that the global social cost of carbon of, say, $190 per ton of CO2 can be broken down into the country-level social cost of carbon, where the equality holds that the sum of the country-level social cost of carbon adds up to the global social cost of carbon. So we here make use of a paper by Rikke et al. In Nature that estimates what share each country holds of the global social cost of carbon. This is what you see in this pie chart. You see that the USA holds a large chunk. That's not only because it's exposed to climate damage, but it's also, this is maybe something that is not fairly fair in the way that these things are estimated, because they are wealthier today, so they have more economic value to lose. So given this, we ask, right, what are the country level benefits if a country were to fully pay for its own phase out, paying for its investment costs to replace coal and its opportunity cost of coal? And we by and large actually find that it is negative, except for a few countries like the USA and sometimes China. And it remains negative even if you can let the private sector pay for 75% of the opportunity cost. And by the way, maybe one more thing to say about the previous slide here, which I forgot to mention, right? There's one economic approach, which is the Pigovian approach of carbon taxation to internalize an externality. And there's the other approach, which is the Cogen approach of bargaining and contracting, which can also attain the same efficient social outcome. So what we show here at the global level is that it's sound economic logic to pay for the investment cost in renewables and the opportunity cost of coal, because it makes us as a world better off, right? So that's the inside of Coase, who's saying, it is sound economic logic to pay your polluter to stop polluting if it makes you better off. So basically, at the level of the world, we're saying here, climate finance is not just equitable, but it's in our economic interest, right, to provide this at scale, importantly. So next we ask, okay, so it's not often in the interest yet, at least at a low estimate of the social cost of carbon without considering air pollution benefits, for countries to pay for their replacement fully, even if they can get private capital to pay for some of it, which might explain some of the lack of climate action of countries to do enough. Is it in the interest of advanced countries to help pay for decarbonization of emerging and developing market economies? And by the way, I want to say one more thing about my previous slide, which I did not mention yet, which is that if you think about the cost to phase out coal, you take the current energy mix or coal mix in the country, you project its phase out pipeline and its phase out plan and its phase in plan, and you attach the cost to it, which is the opportunity cost of coal and the investment cost in renewables. What we are arguing is that it's sound economic logic to simply pay as a government with grants for the closure of coal. Even though the stranded asset value is positive, it's much, much smaller than the social global economic benefits from avoided pollution. Since closing coal doesn't generate a revenue stream, you cannot crowd in private capital to help pay for it. So we are arguing you just have to offer subsidies to close it. And what we show in this paper empirically is that the cost of closing coal globally is around, over the course of this century, around 331 billion, which is 2 magnitudes smaller than the benefits from avoided climate change, and also smaller in magnitude than the investment cost of renewables. The other way you can pay for coal closure is by using carbon credits to basically say, given the avoided emissions by closing this coal, can financial markets pay for this emission offset? But we argue that it's much less likely to result in additionality, and it's also not clear you can sell these carbon credits as a high enough price. So it's more sound to simply pay for closure. But the reason why you can let the private sector pay for part of the renewables is that the renewables in principle will generate a revenue stream from the electricity that they sell. So you can use the public funds to help to bring down the risk relative to return to bring the risk-adjusted return above the hurdle rate so that investors can pay for most of the investment costs in renewables. So here at the bottom plot, we're taking the case where asking, what's the cost relative to the benefit of a country to decarbonize, assuming that the public sector pays 100% of the opportunity cost of coal, 25% of the investment cost in renewables, relative to the benefits that that country will achieve. So what we show in this plot is that if we assume, let's say, that the public sector has to pay only 25% to crowd in private capital, the return on climate finance provided to advanced countries of, let's say, paying for the full cost of decarbonizing emerging and developing market economies is 131 percentage points. So their benefits minus their cost over their cost exceeded by 131%. And for developed countries, that net benefit, that return is 204%. This is assuming that advanced countries would pay literally for all the costs of decarbonizing emerging and developing market economies away from coal. So what we're showing is that it's in the economic interest of the West to pay, even if they literally had to pay for all the costs of decarbonization away from coal. Obviously, it's not necessarily asked for or necessary, given these emerging developing market economies have also some wealth for themselves, that developed countries pay for everything. So we also consider the case where the developed countries would only pay beyond the private benefit of the country itself to decarbonize, which we call emerging top-up, in which case the net benefit to developed countries is even bigger because they essentially pay less. So, and then we essentially show the same thing, not for entire blocks, but we show that if developed countries pay for decarbonization of individual large coal-emitting countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, South Africa, Vietnam, Pakistan, Thailand, Argentina, Malaysia, Egypt, and so on, the net benefit to advanced countries is fairly large. So I hope to have demonstrated to you now that based on super granular empirical study, that under very conservative estimates of the social cost of carbon, there is an economic net benefit to developed countries to help decarbonize emerging and developed market economies. But of course, even if the benefit is net positive, you might still wonder, can the developed countries actually afford it? And if you listen to politicians, they would love to say that they cannot. But actually, we bust that myth in this graph here, and we show that if for example, the advanced countries only have to pay for 25% of the investment cost, where the private sector pays for 75%, if the total cost for developed countries amounts to around 1,254 billion, which if you express that as a percentage of the G7 plus the EU GDP, which is, let's say, the funding coalition, it's only 0.3% of their GDP. And if they had to issue that debt, let's say they raise the money by issuing sovereign debt so that they don't have to tax their own citizens, which might be politically unpopular, if they would raise all that debt up front, it would only raise their debt by around 2.2%. So what we now show is that climate finance at scale by developing emerging market economies is not only net economically beneficial for advanced countries, but it's also fiscally affordable. So there are actually a few existing deals that have been struck that more or less implement in blueprint what we suggest. And these are called Just Energy Transition Partnership deals. These have so far been agreed with South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal. So let's take the one of Indonesia as an example. In this deal, it was a $20 billion deal, of which half of the 20 billion, 10 billion, was paid for by an advanced financier coalition, specifically the G7, the EU, Norway, and Denmark. And the other 10 billion that was sort of crowded in was drawn from the banks that signed up to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero that Mark Carney established. And there was a World Bank, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank were the intermediaries that helped to sort of implement this deal. This deal was focused on phasing out coal early in Indonesia and helping to replace it with early replacement of renewables to help bring down its interim 2030 nationally determined contribution targets. And it's meant to be a just energy transition where the opportunity costs of coal are compensated. So in blueprint, these deals do what we actually suggested in our paper before some of these deals were struck. But still they are facing some issues of implementation today, which we at least argue in part has to do with how these deals have been offered. So the Indonesian deal was only 20 billion, whereas the Indonesian government estimates they need around 100 billion. We estimate they need around 250 billion. Our estimate is higher because Indonesian government just says, okay, we want to slightly lower our interim target, whereas we're saying it needs to be net zero aligned and carbon budget aligned. So one of the problems is that these deals have not been offered at scale. And another issue is that most of the money for these deals has been offered for concessional loans to help crowd in private capital to pay for the renewable pipeline, the phase-in pipeline, whereas only 2% of the deal was grants to actually pay for early closure of coal and coal-fired power plants. Now, the issue in Indonesia is that the grid is already oversupplied with coal. So unless governments are willing to pay sufficient grants to close coal early, it's going to be really hard for Indonesia to add enough renewables. And that's exactly what they haven't done, because I've worked a lot with these development institutions. Most do not actually realize that paying grants, paying the polluter to stop polluting, is in the economic interest of development institutions and their funders, the government, right? So they feel that giving grants for closure is charity giveaway. Whereas we're saying, if you pay grant equivalent money to close coal early and also to crowding capital, not just take the senior loan tranche, but take the junior at risk tranche, it's in your economic interest. And for the renewable part, you might well get a return. It's not even necessarily money lost, right? So that's the final thing I want to say. So let me now conclude with just 2 notes on the new quantified goal of climate finance. So or maybe just one more thing to say. So what we basically argue is that these deals should be done at scale, paid in grant equivalent money, and replicated with the biggest coal producer, so that you quickly add up to a global deal to phase out coal specific, and you can do this also for fossil fuels. Okay, so what's COP29 about? So at the COP21 in 2015, the Paris Agreement was agreed. And even before that, at COP15 in 2009, developed countries offered to pay 100 billion of climate finance a year to emerging and developing market economies. And this pledge of 100 billion a year that was meant to be offered by 2020 to emerging and developing market economies was taken up as part of the Paris Agreement. And ultimately it was met late in 2022. Now, it was always understood that the 100 billion a year to developing countries was a political number, not reflecting the needs of emerging and developing market economies. Now, already part of the Paris Agreement, it was said that the COP before 2025, meaning COP29 right now, will be the COP where countries will agree on what is called a new common quantified goal of climate finance, where developed countries are going to set a new goal of how much they're going to provide to developing economies. The last meeting was in October 9 at Baku. I've listened to it. And essentially, the presentation that was given is that there are a few elements of this, the goal formulation here. One is, what is the quantum? So how much is going to be provided? And currently on the discussion is that there will be a public quantum of how much the government will provide, as well as a private quantum of how much they hope the private sector will be able to be crowded in. When will that climate finance be delivered? What is the scope? Is it only mitigation and adaptation, or also loss and damage? What are the sources? Are only developing countries asked to contribute, or are also wealthier economies like China asked to contribute? And what counts as climate finance? Is it concessional loans or grant equivalent money? And then other qualitative elements. So this is more or less what I explained in the previous slide. So what we essentially find based on our paper is that if you just focus on the mitigation aspect, and within that just on coal, at a very minimum annually, governments of developed countries should be offering 190 billion US dollars of grant equivalent money to help pay for the opportunity cost and the investment cost in renewables away from coal. And over the 2030 time horizon, that adds up to around 1.3 trillion. Importantly, any such pledge should not be delayed or phased in over a 5-year, 10-year time horizon. It has to happen now, because we have 200 gigatons of carbon budget left. So it has to start at scale today. So then just the final note, and then I'll turn over the floor to my discussants. There's a really interesting paper that Jeffrey Hill, who is here, and Caroline Flammer wrote on blended finance. And they studied existing deals of the International Finance Corporation, where they use public funds to make it attractive for private capital to fund projects that have some social public good value. And essentially, right, they basically said, right, what are the projects that are relevant for blended finance? Well, it's projects that have a sort of positive social return, but where the private return to investor does not exceed the hurdle rate. So with blended finance, you essentially want to bring that risk-adjusted return above the hurdle rate. Now, their paper is a paper that has studied what I call project-based blended finance previous cases, right? So these are here in the study that they've done, they've looked at cases where public and private funds were mixed to pay for individual projects of renewables and other social good initiatives. But what we're arguing, Patrick and I, is that if we want to deliver scale and speed, which is the name of the game of solving climate change and doing so in time, project-based finance or project-based blended finance is not good enough. So these just energy transition partnership deals are pioneering because they are the first examples of countrywide deals where essentially money is offered at the country level to help pay for its decarbonization, its phase-out pipeline, and its phase-in pipeline. And that's absolutely also essential, because imagine, and this was a paper by Olivier Darmoni at Columbia, if you just phase out coal without, as a country or as the investors, if you divest from coal, as he showed in his paper in Europe, but there's no plan for what to build in its place, then governments will not allow it. So Olivier Darmoni showed that, that investors in Europe divested from coal assets, and then the Polish government ended up buying it. So there was no emission reduction in the end. Similarly, you cannot add renewables to the, just pay for the phasing of renewables if you don't have a plan for how to connect it to the grid. So what we're essentially saying is that climate finance at scale, which will hopefully be offered through this new common quantified goal of climate finance at COP29, is essential, right? It's in our economic interest as the West, but also essential because emerging and developing market economies typically feel that they cannot pay for decarbonization themselves. And it can help to implement the nationally determined contributions that they are going to update in 2025, which is the first, these NDCs are updated only once every 5 years. So 2025 is a key date when they're going to do it again. And essentially, the money offered can help pay for the implementation of an ambitious NDC of developing market economies, paying for the phase-out pipeline with grants, and paying for the phase-in pipeline with system-wide blended finance, where you use blended finance not at the project level, but where you use the assets that are going to be phased in the phase-in pipeline, possibly pull them together in a countrywide fund, and then apply the blending of the right mix. And so what Jeffrey Hill showed in his paper.
Elisa, could you conclude within 2 minutes? Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm actually done. So basically, what Jeffrey Hill showed in his paper is that there are different blending instruments that can be used. And so, an open question is, what is the right blending mix to bring down the risk sufficiently much for decarbonization in emerging and developing market economies? And so how can you, basically go from project-based blended finance to system-wide finance? So I'll conclude here. This is indeed the end. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation.
Thank you.
Look forward to the discussant's remarks.
Thank you very much, Elisa. And I see that you already started the discussion with the panelists. So before giving the floor to Lasse and Jeff, let me tell the audience that you will be allowed to raise your question live at the end of the two panelists' presentation. So in order to do that, please raise your hand during the presentation, and I will give you the floor at the end of this sequence of presentation by the two discussants. So given this, I give the floor to Lasse.
Thanks a lot. Alyssa, do you want to unshare your screen, please?
Oh yeah, sorry, I apologize.
All right, great. So let me share mine. Hopefully you can see it. And
it'd be better in full screen, Lasse. Okay, perfect.
All right, great. So it's my pleasure to discuss the economic case for climate finance at scale. And so what I will do is I'll first very quickly recap the paper, and then I will try to make some comparisons to other approaches, and then I'll make a few comments on the proposal. So first, very briefly, to recap the paper. Let me see if I can get this laser pointer to work. Yeah. I think the starting point of the analysis is this notion of the social cost of carbon. And so I think it's useful just to remind us of where that comes from. So what Nordhaus and others have done is they have taken some economic assumptions combined with some climate assumptions, and had a trade-off between economic growth and the climate damages in an integrated assessment model, and then based on that trade-off concluded that we shouldn't destroy the climate, and we should think about a social cost of capital, which has different levels depending on who makes the estimate, but it's high enough that we don't destroy the climate. And we can, one way to think about addressing this externality is to have a carbon tax equal to the social cost of carbon. Now, what this paper does is then takes the social cost of capital to compute the benefit and cost of replacing coal, and concludes that the benefit of replacing coal is greater than the cost. Now, at a very high level, this is actually not surprising, I would argue, because we kind of already knew from Nordhaus that we shouldn't destroy the climate, and that, you know, social cost of capital is high enough that we shouldn't destroy the climate. So therefore, we kind of know that, you know, one of the dirtiest technologies, coal, should be phased out. And so just the whole notion that the benefit of replacing coal is greater than the cost, I think, is not surprising. But what is very interesting, nevertheless, is to think about, you know, how those costs and benefits are distributed around the world. So the benefits are largely global because we have one atmosphere, but the costs are largely local. You know, every country itself has to pay its own costs potentially to replace coal, and so that leads to a free rider problem. And clearly, really quantifying that at the country level, I think, is a very interesting and important analysis. And also this proposal how to fix it, I think, is both interesting and important. I think that's what the paper delivers in a very useful way. But I think the broader point is really how to solve climate change, both thinking about emissions domestically and abroad. And so I want to kind of compare and contrast different ways to address the domestic emissions and emissions from abroad, because the whole notion of the paper here is that the rich countries should pay the poor countries not to emit. So it's sort of a way of thinking about these emissions from abroad. But, you know, there are other ways to think about that. And in terms of ways to address climate change, I think each of them actually can be broken down along these dimensions, domestic versus abroad. So we can think about sort of the PIGUA approach, where you have a carbon tax, you tax the externality. You can have a sort of a green finance notion where you try to think about the cost of capital, and then you can have more an approach based on subsidies. If we start with the first, obviously the way that's implemented globally is to think about a carbon tax or an emission trading system is actually becoming more popular globally. Not as popular as one would like, but still more popular than a carbon tax. And interestingly, there is also sort of a global dimension to this, is how do you think about the carbon border adjustment mechanism? And Europe now has one that's for short called CBAM. And I'll talk about each of these in a little more detail in a second. But before I talk about the details, let me just again at a high level contrast that to green finance, which again I would think about ways of thinking about the cost of capital instead of the cost of the pollution. So, one way to think about that is, for instance, ESG investing is a very big trend where investors are trying to direct their capital to green investments more so than brown investments, to lower the cost of capital for green investment relative to brown investment, which would have a higher cost of capital. And there are various forms of sustainable finance regulation that would also affect the loan rates and the corporate bond yields. And the power of this mechanism potentially, as we think about this dichotomy, domestic versus abroad, is that the financial markets are largely global. So you could have, hope that this effect would apply globally, even in countries outside of your jurisdiction. And then lastly, we have the notion of subsidies. And domestically, that's basically called industrial policy. It's something that the new Draghi report talks about, and it's something that the US has basically targeted through this Inflation Reduction Act. And as the paper points out, there are some global versions of that, the just energy transition plans. And this is really where I think the paper falls in this categories. How do we think about subsidies at the global level and at scale, as the paper likes to emphasize? But let me provide a little more detail on each of these three. So let me start with carbon pricing, or sort of this PIGU approach. So obviously, domestically, or if you could do it globally, having a carbon price naturally creates an incentive not to emit because you're going to pay a lot of money, and some companies could face huge bills for their emissions. Obviously, this also creates an incentive to innovate green solutions, both within a company, but also you could be a green firm providing green solutions for other firms. And, as an economist, you'd think that if you could save other firms hundreds of billions or millions of dollars for, in carbon taxes, you could be extremely profitable. And if you're extremely profitable, that should naturally lead to investment. So in other words, the natural economic mechanism would suggest that if future carbon prices are credible, and this is an important part of it, then you wouldn't necessarily need to find, the public or the private money. The money would pursue the opportunity, and the opportunity would potentially be huge if there was a credible and long-term high carbon price. So it's not clear you would have to find the money. The money would find the investment. And I think one example is during the Ukraine war, we saw energy prices go up, and we saw a lot of people being very creative in trying to save on energy in a variety of ways. Now, what about the global version? Well, what Europe is introducing is this carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, at the high level, you can think of this as a way to address the competitive disadvantage of the local firms. That when the local firms compete, at least at the local market within the EU, with global firms that are not paying this tax, they would be at a disadvantage. But then if you tax the foreign firms, so based on the embedded emissions inside their production, so if you produce some goods, you want to sell them in Europe, if those goods are produced in a way that has some embedded carbon emissions, you should pay the carbon tax, and that would, put the European countries at a competitive, equal terms with the global firms, at least in the European market. When they're then trying to export abroad, they might still face some challenges, but at least in Europe, that's the idea. Now, interestingly, it actually has broader implications because it also incentivizes other countries to introduce carbon pricing. In particular, if another country wants to export to Europe, they would have to pay Europe the carbon tax that they didn't charge themselves. But if the country itself charges a carbon tax, then their local firms would not have to pay this carbon border adjustment tax to Europe. So in other words, if they want to keep the money at home, they can just make their own carbon tax. And that's actually really creating a lot of attention in a lot of countries. A lot of countries are thinking about introducing carbon pricing in the face of the CBAM mechanism. And the US, in fact, even has several bills related to carbon tariffs, both by Democrats and Republicans of different forms. So I think it is a promising mechanism, but we still have the issue of what about countries that are not relying on exports, and the fact that even many countries don't really have carbon prices even at home. So if you can't do it at home, obviously, how are we going to really get other countries to play along? So another mechanism is this green finance, which I mentioned, has the benefit that capital markets are indeed global. Green finance is a big trend. There are, incredible amounts of assets. About half global assets have signed or more some kind of pledge to be responsible in the investment. Whether they're actually doing anything about it is a different matter, but at least there's that attention. There's, the vast majority of global central banks and regulators have joined the network for greening the financial system. So there's a push to try to increase the cost of capital of brown firms relative to green in various ways. But can that fix the problem? As Alyssa mentioned, I actually have a paper where I try to estimate the magnitude required here. And if you take the number that the paper here, Alyssa and Patrick's paper, they talk about, for instance, an $80 per metric ton carbon or social cost of carbon. I estimate under some assumption that corresponds to an 8 percentage points difference in the cost of capital for green versus brown, which is just an incredibly high difference that, you cannot, I think, hope to achieve just by having some investors disinvesting from the brown, because if you could make 8 percentage point more from brown investment, there unfortunately would be a lot of investors who would jump on that opportunity even before the required return went as high as 8%. So getting that magnitude is very difficult. And also, as Alyssa also mentioned, I show in the paper that fixing the issue of stranded assets, getting firms to completely stop using assets that are still profitable, cannot really be done. A carbon tax can make an otherwise profitable brown energy firm unprofitable, but this green finance approach can make the net present value of those profits smaller, but if you're making money, you're still going to be making money. So you're not going to be stopping those kinds of operations. Also, in another very related and a relatively new paper with the co-authors Askelsen, Ebert, and Jensen, we show, it's called In Search of the True Greenium, that the cost of capital difference right now between green and brown firms is around 0.6% per year. So much less than the 8% required. So for both of those reasons, it seems like green finance is not currently enough domestically or abroad. And I think it's hard to imagine that it'll ever be big enough to fully solve climate global warming. So what about this paper's approach of
2 minutes? 2 minutes, Nas.
Sorry?
I give you 2 or 3 minutes maximum.
Yes.
Thanks.
So on the benefit side, as I said, they basically compute the social cost of capital times the saved emissions, and they distribute those according some saved damages, and the costs are basically investment plus opportunity cost distributed across different sharing schemes. So first the question is it too large? And if you just look at basically paying for the whole thing up front, paying, let's say, 9% of GDP, that's probably not realistic. But I think it is more realistic that you distribute that cost over the years. And in that case, 0.25% of GDP for G7 and Europe, it seems like something that you could definitely do. Now, of course, some European countries that are included here are not rich. They're in fact perhaps even poorer than some of the countries they're supposed to be paying for. So that's one issue here that I think you need to think about a little more. Also, you need to think about whether this is more politically feasible than a carbon tax or carbon pricing. So a carbon tax, remember, is something you collect domestically, and then you can pay it out to your own citizen or reduce other taxes or pay it out, send a check to everybody. But this is sending checks to other countries. So if a carbon tax is politically unpopular, I don't know if sending huge checks to other countries are more popular. I guess that's a political question. It's interesting to think about, but I think it's something that needs to address. In terms of the blended finance, I guess I'm running out of time, but you can also sort of quibble with exactly the economics of how do you get to the 25% to 50%, and perhaps that's something the other discussant will talk about more. But in the end, the paper concludes that we should scale up just energy transition plans, and I think that is certainly a very interesting proposal. So let me conclude by saying that it's an important topic. Climate change can be addressed. This is what I think. True, if the world acts very fast right now, we can do it. It's not like we don't have the technology. We can do it. The paper has a number of interesting insights, basically that subsidies to the poor part of the world are likely part of the solution. I agree with that. I think it is part of the solution. I think the paper has a very interesting discussion of why it's not happening enough already, the fact that it can in fact be done, and some ways to do it. And I think it's interesting to compare and contrast the 3 approaches: carbon pricing, green finance, subsidies. I think there's something you said for all of them, but I think carbon pricing is an important part as well. And I think we should just get it going. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lasse. A very interesting discussion. Without further discussion, let me give the floor to Jeff.
Okay, folks, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Christian, for inviting me to talk at this session. I've enjoyed it very much so far. I don't know whether I'll enjoy my own talk, but I just certainly enjoyed the other two. And thank you, Alyssa and Patrick, for a very stimulating couple of papers. And I read the two papers, the Great Carbon Arbitrage and the one that this is actually focused on, the shorter paper. And I guess I'm talking primarily actually about the Great Carbon Arbitrage paper. As is the role of a discussant, I will be raising a few niggling points, but let me just say up front that I think the papers are very interesting. I think they're basically on target. I think you're making a very valid point which needs to be made and needs to be made loud and clear. And I think you're making it fairly loud and fairly clear. And it's great that you got the IMF to underwrite it. So a lot of the discussion is of the social cost of carbon. So this is, I'm sure many of you will recognize this page. It's from the Biden administration's analysis of the social cost of carbon emitted, put out last year. As you can see from this, there's no such thing as the social cost of carbon, unfortunately. There's many, many different numbers here. It changes over time and it changes depending on the discount rate. Patrick and Alyssa have chosen to use this number here for many of their calculations, which is roughly speaking the current social cost of carbon, assuming a discount rate of 2%. But as you can see, the social cost of carbon is very, very sensitive indeed to the choice of a discount rate. Quite small changes in the discount rate are leading to massive changes in the social cost of carbon. One of the things I'll discuss later on is the social cost of carbon quite the right number to be using here? But before I get to that, let me just talk a little bit about what you can think of as the microeconomic foundations of this macroeconomic paper. I'm going to do essentially the same calculations as they've done, but in a very different context. It gives a different perspective. So burning 1 ton of coal releases 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide. Now each atom of carbon links with 2 atoms of oxygen. Oxygen atoms are heavier than carbon atoms, so 1 ton of coal leads to 2.5 tons of CO2. And if you price, so the Biden administration gave us 3 prices for CO2 at the moment, from 120 to 340. If you take the 340 price, then the external cost of burning a ton of coal are $850. If you take the middle price, $190, then the external costs of burning a ton of coal are $475. A ton of coal, when you burn it, releases 2,500 kilowatt hours of electricity. In the US at the moment, there's a market price of $125. So basically, you are generating an output whose value is $125, and you're generating external costs associated with that of at least $475, and maybe as high as $850. So every time you burn a ton of coal to produce electricity, you're actually destroying value on a very large scale. The same is true of gas. If you burn 1,000 cubic feet of gas, which is roughly speaking 1 million BTU, that will cost you $5 in the US prices anyway. It produces 135 kilowatt hours, and the value of that in current market prices is about $7. And the produces 0.5 ton of CO2, valued at $18. So again, if you burn gas, you're destroying value. You're producing electricity, which is worth less than the social costs that you're generating. Now let's look at oil. Oil is actually slightly more complex. If you burn oil to produce electricity, the same thing is true. You generate 1 barrel of oil generates $27 worth of electricity and generates social costs of $119. So that's obviously not attractive. However, if you burn the oil in transportation, the numbers actually work out rather differently. If you take 1 jet aircraft flying from New York City to London, it uses about 14,000 gallons of jet fuel, which is 333 barrels. It emits 116 tons of CO2. And if you take the higher price for social cost of carbon, that's $40,000 worth of external costs. Now, if you imagine 200 people on that jet paying $700 each, that's $140,000 worth of output generated. So at this point, the value of the output is actually in excess of the social cost. So oil in transportation, you could possibly justify using oil in transportation. Whether you certainly can't justify using any fossil fuel in electricity generation. I'm not going to develop that point any further. I just put it in there as a provocative thought. So let me get back to the social cost of carbon. As you all know, obviously, it's the marginal damage from emitting another ton of CO2. It's the derivative of the damage function with respect to tons of CO2. And it's a marginal concept. And Patrick and Alyssa and their co-authors are looking at non-marginal changes. So what's the issues associated with applying this marginal concept to non-marginal changes? Well, there's potentially an error here. We need to think about that a little bit. So I've drawn here a couple of cases where you've got the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere on the horizontal axis. You've got the damages from that on the vertical axis. Here you've got a damage function, which is as a positive second derivative. Here you've got a damage function with a negative second derivative. What you're doing is you're taking the current stock of CO2, you're taking the slope of that damage function, which is the current social cost of carbon, and you're applying that to the entire stock. So obviously, if the curve is shaped like this, you're going to overestimate the amount of damage. If the curve is shaped like this, there's negative second derivative, you're going to underestimate the damage. Now, we don't really have any literature on the second derivative of the damage function, unfortunately. It would be nice to have it, but we don't. And my own guess, and this is nothing more than a kind of informed guess, is that the left-hand panel is the right one here. Because in the case of the left-hand panel, the social cost of carbon, the marginal damage from carbon emissions, when the carbon emissions are zero, is zero or close to zero. And that seems to me about right. In a case like this one here, the marginal damage from carbon emissions when the carbon emissions are very low is actually rather high. And that I think is vaguely implausible. So I'm inclined to think that the method that the paper is using is actually producing systematic overestimate of the damage. However, there are other errors which I think go in the opposite direction and probably cancel this out. So I actually inclined to believe the results, but because of cancelling errors. And I think this is something that needs to be tackled in a little bit more detail in the paper. I mean, in the long paper they do talk about this issue, and they talk about Pindyk's work on an average social cost of carbon. But I think what you really want to be doing here, basically, is just integrating along the damage curve, integrating along the damage function. For that, we need much more information than we have. So what do I think that they are not overestimating? Well, I think because they're using a social cost of carbon, which is either 80 or 190. And as Alyssa said, there are plenty of estimates of social cost of carbon which go much, much higher than that. I'm like Alyssa, I'm quite impressed by the paper by Bill Allen and Kenzik, which comes up with an estimate of the social cost of carbon of the order of $1,000 a ton. There are other quite serious estimates of the order of $500 or $600 a ton. So I think that the fact that you're using too low a social cost of carbon probably cancels out the error from using a linear approximation when you shouldn't be. It's worth mentioning at this point. There's another carbon arbitrage you could talk about. The direct air capture of carbon is something which is beginning to happen on an infinitesimal scale. There are companies like Climeworks, Heritage Carbon, Carbon Engineering, all of which are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and mineralizing it in the ground. And they'll do that today for about $800 a ton. And the cost, they claim, is falling. If the cost of that ever comes below the social cost of carbon, then it's economically worthwhile to pay for large-scale direct air capture of carbon. And that's another another form of carbon arbitrage. Now Alyssa talked a bit about blended finance, and she was kind enough to cite a paper that Caroline Flammer, Thomas Giroux, and I have written on that. Let me just talk a little bit about blended finance. My last couple of remarks here. Think about for a moment about a project which requires an investment of $100 and has a return that is uniformly distributed between $0 and $10. I'm keeping all the numbers really simple here that we can do this stuff in our head. The expected return obviously is $5, which is also 5%. And the variance of that happens to be 8.33 if you work out the variance. And this is, we suppose, not attractive to a commercial investor who needs a higher rate of return. So we imagine that as a way of blending, a multilateral development bank of some sort co-invests $50. It puts in $50 at a zero interest rate. So it's a debt, but it's zero interest rate. So they're looking for no return on their $50. So that leaves the commercial investor to put in $50, and they can claim the whole return. So again, the return is distributed uniformly between 0 and 10, but that now amounts to between 0 and 20%, given that only $50 is being invested. And we now have a mean return, an expected return of 10%, and a variance actually of 33. So we've doubled the expected return, but quadrupled the variance by this form of blending here. You know, sub-commercial investments, or philanthropic investments, or whatever, can raise the return to a commercial investor, but they can also change the variance, increase the riskiness of the proposition. Now, I've taken a particularly simple case here, a very straightforward co-investment. If you do more complicated deals than this, you can actually keep the riskiness more or less constant. But it needs deals with a particular structure, and the particular structure obviously will depend upon whether the returns are uniformly distributed or distributed according to some log normal or power law or something of that sort. So there's a certain amount of deal structuring to match particular cases, and it has to be structured there. This is actually very similar to the diagram of ours that Alyssa put up. I want to talk about what's the optimal thing to do. We want to crowd in as much private capital as possible to blended finance. We want to bring in as much private capital as possible. So what we've got here is the return on the vertical axis, either in dollars or percent. Then I'm ordering projects by their private rate of return. So project number 1 has the highest rate of return, project number 2 has the second highest rate of return, project number 3 has the third highest rate of return, and so on. And these are the number of the projects along the horizontal axis here. And these are the private returns on the projects going down as the number increases. This is the private hurdle rate here. So some projects with low numbers have a private rate of return which exceeds the private hurdle rate. And these projects are privately profitable, and the market will fund them. So we don't have to worry about these. There may not be very many of them, but however many there are, we don't have to worry about them too much. Projects beyond this point here are not privately fundable because the private return falls short of the hurdle rate. So what we have to do is to fund these. We have to fund this one to this degree, this one to this degree, this one to this degree, and so on. So we'll be a different return and shortfall for each of these projects. And the ones with small shortfalls need only relatively minor blending, and the ones with large shortfalls need major blending. And effectively, what you're going to do here is a form of price discrimination, and treat the structure deals separately so as to maximize the number of these deals that you can possibly fund, given the budget you have available. Sorry, I checked my mistakes there. Okay, so that's just some sense of how we can think about the process of crowding in private finance in these blended finance deals. Let me make just one last remark, which is that in a lot of cases, the projects are probably described not by uncertainty of the conventional type, but by ambiguity, in the sense that we have certainly we don't know what the outcomes are likely to be, but we don't have a well-defined set of probabilities describing them either. So we have to worry about how to handle this kind of blending in the context of ambiguity. And in a revised version of our paper, which hasn't been circulated yet, we have some discussion of how you extend this analysis to ambiguity. Okay, so let me just stop at that point. Again, thank Patrick and Alyssa and Christian for a great session.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Indeed, this is an important topic. I think we all agree that coal should be removed from the energy mix in the world as soon as possible. Gas could stay a little bit longer, but not too long, and oil sometime will also disappear. But I think we all agree that oil should disappear. The big news of the Alyssa presentation is that it's not only socially desirable at the level of the planet, it's also profitable in a specific sense for the North to subsidize the decarbonization, the exit of coal in the South. So that's new. So before giving the floor back to Alyssa and Patrick for replying to the discussion, let me see whether there are questions from the audience. I see Novena Padala has raised his or her hand. Let me activate her microphone. So Novena, you can raise your question. Could you? Let me see. could you, Novena, could you raise your question? I think I gave you the floor. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was very quite insightful. My question is on how do we take AI and consider the AI consumption. So one argument is that Microsoft and other AI-driven companies promote the idea that energy efficiency leads to lower overall energy consumption, but this disregards the Jevons paradox, and which suggests that increased efficiency can actually drive higher energy use. So I'm wondering, how do we address this contradiction? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there are two other questions, but before asking Gabriela and Suborna to raise their question, let me offer the possibility for Lasse and Patrick to reply to the two discussion and to Novena question.
Okay, I guess it's my turn.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Patrick. Hello.
I didn't want to interrupt a very clear and to the point presentation that Alyssa gave. I think the message came across. I think just to respond to Lasse and Jeff, by the way, thanks a lot for your comments. So I think what if you had to, tell your friends after the webinar is over, what's the point of this paper? What's in the point? What's the big takeaway? Yeah. So the big takeaway is that you want to think about renewable energy development, not just as an addition, more energy capacity, but as a replacement. That's the key. And then you want to combine replacement with development. That's the key. And once you do that, you realize actually the replacement generates a valuable asset, which is avoided emissions. And there are many different ways you can price it, but even very conservative pricing, and then you generate income because that's something that's worthwhile for the rest of the world. That's one way of resolving the free rider problem. So I think that I would like you to remember that as a takeaway. Now, briefly, Jeff, your point about the social cost of carbon, so average versus marginal. So we essentially just rely on what Bob Pindyke's analysis. And what he did is he did a survey and he asked thousands of experts, what's your sense of how much we need to decarbonize to avoid a 20% decline in GDP by a certain date? Okay, and the response of all, he got lots of responses from economists, scientists, climate scientists, and so on. Guess what? The economists came up always with the lowest estimates, always. The scientists sometimes, they came up with 300 per ton, 400 per ton, even higher, 1,000. The economists always much lower than everyone else. And the lowest, absolute lowest number is the lowest number of economists, and that's the one we picked, $80 per ton. So I think that's another way you want to look at it in terms of getting an estimate. I think at this point we can only give a ballpark estimate because, as you said, Jeff, we don't know. We don't know what the shape of this curve is. Nobody studied this, so we're completely in the dark.
Can I add something, Patrick, to what you said? The point actually of Pindyke's paper is to say, right, we need this large-scale emission reduction of 20% at least to avoid this climate catastrophe. So what's the lowest estimate of the social cost of carbon on average, right? As you say, the integral under the curve, over that 20% large-scale emission reduction, and that's $80, right? So in some sense, that's capturing, I believe, your left graph, where it's the 80 is not the marginal social cost of carbon, it's the average social cost of carbon across a 20% emission reduction, which is actually, they estimate that 20% emission reduction to be 1,100 gigatons over the course of the century, which is basically actually the same as the emission reduction of 1,400 gigatons.
Patrick,
can you just quickly answer the question? I don't want to.
I would like, Patrick,
that.
I would like to hear you in particular on last comments on social acceptability in the North.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
But okay, so the point of our quantitative analysis on the distribution of the benefits and who might be willing to pay was really to get a sense of what would be the fiscal burden if G7 plus a few other rich countries were to pay the 25% share needed, and I think the big takeaway here is that the numbers are quite low, and I think Lasse emphasized that as well. Is you have to think of this as a transition. It's not going to be done all overnight. So you're going to be spending money year after year, and if you look at it in terms of how spreading the money over time as you decarbonize, it's a number like 0.3% of GDP. That's very much in the ballpark. I think what it speaks to, the acceptability point. So since Copenhagen, we've been stuck on the 100 billion, right? No progress. Now, this is a way of making it much more palatable for advanced countries who have to deliver. You want to explain there's a big benefit of providing the 100 billion if you do it right. That's a huge benefit for us. Right now, it's all just framed in terms of, oh, it was unfair. Rich countries polluted a lot. Poor countries are suffering. Rich countries need to pay. It's true, it's unfair. But, that argument has limited political weight, whereas I think that is explaining the benefits is important. Anyway, but quickly the answer to the question that was asked. Yeah, I mean, AI is completely changing a lot of the calculations. It's just completely crazy. What we're going to see in terms of energy demand, electricity demand from AI, it's going to be explosive, in a very short term. And all the evidence suggests that in the short term, every time we can get increased electricity production capacity for data centers and so on, it always comes from fossil fuel burning, natural gas primarily. So this is a huge negative for the climate from AI that needs to be addressed very, very seriously.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me offer the opportunity to Suborna and Gabriela to raise their two questions. So, Suborna.
Hi, thank you. It's been a wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question actually has already been partly answered by Patrick. So but I'd like to ask, and thanks, Elisa, for the great presentation. But one part is the paper actually, as far as I can understand it, it more pronounces the social the benefit that's going to be accrued by at the global level or at the, let's say, country level. But when the deal making comes in place, we see that people are microeconomic agents and they try to maximize their benefits. So it's everyone's objective. So at the deal making level, let's say in the COP, for example, so even if you think from the private investors' perspective as well, they would be probably more interested in seeing the financial case. They could be prioritizing the financial case more than the greater good of the whole world. So these sort of things make things really, really complicated. I'm based in Bangladesh, so I work in the Climate Finance Committee of the government. So I see that we face, if I try to convince them that look, this is globally this is good for the world, please do it, they're not going to be convinced, right? So I think your paper makes a very strong case at the macro level, but could you dig into it and try to have some implications how these, micro level deal making criticalities could be, some sort of implications from your paper we'd be expecting. Thank you.
Thank you, Suborna. And Gabriela, your mic is on. Gabriela?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much to the speakers and for the paper and the discussion. I have two complete questions here. I'm surprised that you don't discuss all the resources that can be obtained from removing subsidies to fossil fuel companies, especially those applied to companies in developed countries, not just for developing countries, but the OECD and the IEA has a big report on how much subsidies are given to these companies. And that can be used for climate finance, right? So the other thing is that I don't see my discussion of, besides the possibility of having a carbon price or carbon tax, which is very difficult, but in the absence of that policy, how do you incentivize institutions, companies, the government to provide climate finance? There's no discussion about that because everything is about how much money and loans and equities. But how do you incentivize these agents to provide this climate
Thank
finance?
you. Thank you, Gabriela. Patrick, you have 2 minutes for
just
final comments.
Very quickly, our time is up. So thanks, Gabriela. And I actually already forgot the first name. Sorry about that. Both excellent questions. Now, on the first question about Bangladesh, I think the way you want to read our paper is that it's the rest of the world that needs to help Bangladesh finance their renewable development path, and if it has a coal operations to phase out coal, it's not up to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is offering a public good to the rest of the world, but if it does that, and it's the rest of the world that's disproportionately benefiting. So that's sort of the point of the paper, is to show how much the rest of the world ought to invest in decarbonization of the energy sector in Bangladesh, and is it a crazy number, and how you do it? That's sort of the point of the paper. Now, on the second question, how do we incentivize government, and also the subsidies? Definitely the subsidies. A lot of we're all economists. Like Jeff said, whenever we're burning coal, we're destroying value. How can you destroy value on a systematic basis for years and decades, and still say that the economy somehow functions in a proper way, right? We're destroying value, and it's even worse than the way Jeff put it, because you take a country like Poland, the coal operations in Poland, they're loss-making. The mines are losing money. They're actually losing money, and the government is paying 1.5 billion per year to keep them open. Yeah, so that's the scale of the absurdity, and yes, you want to take those subsidies and redeploy them, repurpose them to finance the energy transition. Absolutely. And then how do you incentivize governments? I think that's a bigger topic. It's really, how do you bring in MDBs, multilateral development banks, and so on? There's a way to do it, but I think we're running out of time, so I will leave that aside.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Alisa. Thank you, Jeff. And Las, I think it was a very useful discussion, very entertaining and rich in contribution to the reflection. I hope that negotiators going to the COP29 are hearing us, and that will be helpful to find an agreement next month. So thank you very much. See you next time for the next CEPR EAERE webinar. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for the process. I really appreciated it. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Lasse.